Welcome to another video from Nara JALT. Nara JALT is the Nara chapter of the Japan Association of Language Teaching, and I am the chapter president, current chapter president, Lee McDowell. And what we do at Nara JALT is host events bringing language teachers together for professional presentations and discussions on numerous aspects of language teaching, typically centered around classroom practices and some theory, and traditionally live and face-to-face in venues here in Nara. But of course in 2020, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we have moved pretty much all of our activities online. And so in this video, we present a Zoom conversation with two former members of the Nara chapter of JALT, Dr. Stephen Nishida and Professor Jim Swan. Stephen Nishida now lives in California, but he spent 16 years living and working here in Nara, where he started up his own private language school. He later became a faculty member at the Nara Institute of Science and Technology, where he was heading the International Liaisons Office. On top of that, he was the president of Nara JALT for some time around 2006 to around 2009. And he was also the vice president of JALT at the national level. So he talks with us about how his time in Japan has impacted his career now as a leadership consultant in the corporate world in the United States. Our other guest, Jim Swan, is now retired, but spent much of his career as a professor teaching English at the Nara University. During that time, he was the president of the whole organization of JALT for a number of years, and he was one of the key individuals that has helped shape JALT into what it is today. With Jim, we're able to trace back the history of JALT to the mid-1980s, I think, when it was first established, and also to look at what kind of professional development opportunities that JALT can still offer today. So the audio is a little bit rough in places, and we are still getting a handle on video editing and how to use these technologies, but I hope that the conversation is of interest. You can keep that conversation alive by leaving a comment down in the comments section. We'd love to hear from you, and please enjoy the conversation. Some of our Nara JALT members will, of course, remember you very fondly and very well as a good friend, and but probably a lot of people watching might not be familiar with Steve because you've been out of Japan for some time now. Could you give us a little background about yourself and particularly your career in the States now?
Yeah, sure. The quick sort of backstory is that I was born and raised in California. I was born in the Central Valley of California, and then moved to Los Angeles when I was quite young. Did all my schooling here in Los Angeles, and then after finishing my undergraduate work, I moved to Japan, and I was there for what was supposed to be 2 or 3 years to learn a bit of the language and learn about the culture a bit. My father's side of the family is originally from Japan, so I'm fourth generation on my father's side. And
that's the name Nishida.
That turned in Nishida, right? So my last name is Nishida, and I look more Japanese than anything else. And yet I didn't speak the language. I didn't have much familiarity with the culture. So I really wanted to go and sort of understand a bit more about Japan. That turned out to be a much longer period of time than I had anticipated. I think many people can relate to that.
Yes, I came here for 1 year, 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a familiar story.
Yep. Our friend Jim Swan told me at one time that there's this 7-year sort of cutoff where if you cross that threshold, it's unlikely that you'll make it back. And he told me that when I had been in Japan for about 9 years. So I thought the ship had sailed already,
Yeah.
so to speak. And eventually ended up finding my way back to the U.S. for a number of reasons, but mostly because I spent 16 years in Japan. I had been a language school teacher and then opened my own school in Nara in the Gakuenmaya area. That school is still going, so I ran it with my business partner for 13 years. A school called English Masters, and then I moved on to work where you are, Lee, at Nara Institute of Science and Technology, and was there for
This is your
about
office.
9
This
years.
is your former office.
I designed that office. But it was really a great opportunity to go and do something different and work in higher ed while I was there. So after those 16 years, I had really been looking all the way through at what I wanted to do for grad school. I always knew that I wanted to go back and do some graduate work, but I wasn't sure what field it would be in. And it was through my experiences, particularly in JALT, but also at NICE, that I realized that although I had always sort of found myself falling into leadership or spokesperson type roles, that what I really had a lot of passion for was being a part of helping others to develop their leadership skills and capabilities, right? And so that when I realized that there was a field out there where people studied and practiced leadership development, it allowed me to pull together sort of these two worlds that I had been sort of straddling, one on the learning and education side and the other being leadership, where I'd mostly been volunteering my time in professional development in organizations like JALT. So putting those things together really made a lot of sense for me. I did an executive master's degree in organizational psychology at Teachers College in New York. And so that's a focus on change leadership, really. And then I fell so in love with the field that I decided to do some doctoral work as well. And so I enrolled in another cohort-based program that was focused on adult learning and leadership. So all of this to say that I'm really passionate about this space at the intersect between learning and leadership. And in moving to New York while I was working on my doctorate, I found a leadership development consultancy that does work for lots of mostly multinational corporations, where we design custom programs for leaders to help them to become more effective at what they do. And so, again, this is sort of bringing together all that I had done previously in education and learning, and bridging it with that leadership focus. And so now I have this really privileged opportunity to work with clients in every different kind of industry. And what I love about it is that the work is always different, right? So there's always a different population of people who have different needs. The culture in each organization is different. And so it's my job as a consultant that's helping to design these programs and interventions to really dig in and try to understand what those participants' specific needs will be and how we can address them from an instructional design standpoint and delivering the program for them. So the company that I work for is called Impact. It's at impactinternational.com. So I've been with them for 4 years now. Really love the work. We, as I mentioned, focus on leadership development. On the one hand, that's sort of where our organization has made a name for itself over the past 40 years. We're also increasingly working in the area that I studied first when I went back to do my master's, which is in change leadership, right? So it's really this focus on culture transformations and really the people side of change, right? So less about the structural mechanics side of it and more about what it means to lead through and with others in times of transition and change, and to help organizations to move from one place to being, having mindsets and behaviors that are quite different on the other side of it. And then the last
few months, has your stock gone up with the, there's been a fair bit of change in 2020.
It's the thing that I always joke with people about, is that there's certainly job security in the field that I'm in, because as the job gets harder, right? Any leader's job gets harder, they're going to lean more heavily on those who can help them to sort of hone their skills and refine their perspectives. And so we do the last pillar, sort of leadership development, and then change and transformation. The last pillar that we really focus on is what we call sustainable innovation, but it's helping organizations to become much more sort of aware and engaged with some of these social issues that really companies and their employees tend to be getting a lot more focused on, in terms of value alignment and, why someone would want to stay with a particular organization. Our motto is to create organizations worth working for. And so that's really the focus, and we try to partner with our clients in that.
Wow. So that's very much the corporate context, isn't it? Although your background is very much in education.
Yeah, it is. And I have to tell you that was that has been the toughest part of the transition.
Right.
My boss, our CEO, always says that we need to be culture chameleons, right? You need to be able to walk into any organization and recognize how people talk, how they operate, sort of, what level of formality that people communicate in, and some areas are quite high context. And I find that my experience in Japan over those 16 years in such a high context environment, where the honorifics and the attention to who's in what role and who's speaking first and that sort of thing just teaches you to really be listening and watching and monitoring as you engage in a group of people. So that's a big piece of it.
Well, that's really interesting, and that's what I wanted to touch on is how your time in Japan has impacted your career, your current career now in that corporate context. And so this sort of what we call Japanese style communication, very high, I think, who was it? I can't remember the researcher that used the term high context. Edward, I can't think of the name at the moment, but yes,
we'll look it up.
Yeah, certainly high context culture, meaning that you have to really read between the lines. And if you think about speaking and listening, you have to be, obviously you have to do both, but I think Japanese communication style really emphasizes the importance of listening. And there's a lot of kind of implicit messaging, and even the language itself can be, intentionally vague, for example, omitting subjects and whatnot. So yeah, that's interesting, and something I'd like to dig more into, your time in Japan, and how that's, what kind of professional development lessons that you could have drawn from that experience that you had here in Japan, which was, how many years did you say you were here?
I was in Japan for 16 years.
16 years.
Yeah, first for 1 year and then for 15. So I went in 1998 for a year, and then came back just before the big crazy Y2K scare, for anybody who was around for that.
I remember that.
And then found another role in Japan and moved back and spent another 15 years in Japan up until 2015. Yeah. But I think that sort of just continuing on that thought that we were exploring a bit, there were two things that were really hard in terms of finding a role back in the US, right? To have spent 15 years in first, working in essentially running a language school, so the Eikaiwa owners world, and then moving into higher education in various roles. So there was some adjunct teaching that I did at various schools around the Kansai area. And then I took on a couple of full-time roles at NICE. First one being in, specifically in scientific writing and presentation skills and that sort of thing. So I was primarily teaching at one of the graduate schools there, as you know, and then moving into a role where I was heading up the Center for International Relations, which was more of an admin role than it was a teaching role. And so I spent quite a bit of time doing these really unique and fun and interesting and challenging roles. But I guess what was really hard for me then was moving back to the States and trying to help people to see, how does anything that you've done, how is any of that relevant to what you might be able to contribute to our organization here, right? Even if it's within higher ed, the way of operating, the culture, all of it's quite different. And the roles in particular, the skills that I leaned on heavily to be successful in my roles in Japan were not necessarily those that were going to help me get far in a new context, right? And so, being bilingual, being bilingual in Japanese and English is extremely helpful if you're embedded in organizations in Japan. Exactly, but I actively was trying not to work for Japanese organizations or to be using Japanese when I got back, mainly because I didn't want to get pigeonholed into a specific type of role or organization. So that was really hard. It took me a good year and 3 months, I think, to find the right role, and I was quite picky, I think, about that. But the second thing that was really hard was I had just spent 16 years deprogramming my communication style, my way of showing up in groups, my way of sort of making space for others to speak first, to generally defer, be very deferential in my mannerisms and my way of working with others, only to return to the United States where there's much more of an expectation to be sort of leading with some boldness and some demonstrating more confidence and assertiveness, right?
Yeah.
And so I got some feedback as someone who was, leading discussions or setting out to be a facilitator in an organization, that you really need to own the stage, and you need to really sort of, get out there and be quite bold in the way that you present yourself, which was a big hit to me because it's not the kind of thing that you can easily adapt back to. So those two things were the most sort of challenging for me. And I think I've just about gotten control of the dials again, but it's something that's not easy to just turn on and turn off at will.
Right. I had an opportunity to go back and work in my home country, Australia, a few years ago, and I was working in a university and teaching, actually tutoring at that time. And all my teaching experience had been developed here in Japan, and so what I was doing was creating this space for the students in the classroom to be able to interact with each other, and I would give them time to discuss things in pairs and everything, and then report back to the group. And they're just like, they'll just shout out the answer to me straight away. They're like, they don't worry about all this, creating the environment or anything. They're just ready to go, So those, really like subtle, but really deep at the same time, differences in approaches to communication, to life.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes Japan Japan, and what makes America not Japan.
Yeah, the one point that I heard that I heard it a couple of times, and I think it's worth mentioning, is that I was told that my posture and my mannerisms came across as almost apologetic. And the part of me that took that as a compliment, because I knew how long it took for me to become, more reserved and sort of, make myself smaller in groups and sort of bow first and ask questions later, knew that I had come a long way, but that's not what corporate America was looking for.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. That subtle shift between, I think it comes down to sort of individuality and collective approaches to the way that societies are organized along those lines, with
Yeah,
obviously America being more towards the individual and Japan being more towards the collective, makes these huge differences in human beings. And
sure.
you have to, here in Japan, you have to really adapt and to be able to defer, as you say, and to be able
Yeah,
to sort of act very quick to apologize. Japanese people, much quicker than I know us Aussies. That gets me into
yeah.
trouble all the time with my family, by the way, but that's a different story.
I know a little something about that.
um, so I'd like to, Steve, if you don't mind, go back and look at your time with JALT while you were here in Japan, because I know that you've had some um, significant roles. You were the president of JALT. Sorry, you were the president of Nara JALT, the Nara chapter of JALT for some time, and also the vice president of JALT at the national level. Could you give us a little background on your time with JALT here in Japan?
Yes, yes. I attended my first Nara JALT meeting in in the year 2000, I believe. And
Hmm.
no, sorry, no. It was a bit later, right? I think it was around 2003. And
We'd all survived the Y2K
yeah,
apocalypse.
that's
Yeah.
right. And it was one of those where it was a good group of folks that were keeping the meetings going. Some of the folks that I had the good fortune to work with at that time, Rodney Dunham
Mm.
was there, and with lots of energy, as he had been from previous. And Maeda had been attending
Mm.
some meetings as well. And there were a host of folks, Mark Scheffner as well. So lots of people who were there who had so much to offer in terms of guidance. I was fresh back in, I was working in my language school, but trying to really network. And so I attended a meeting. They didn't really have much of a speaker lineup, and in fact, they asked, "Do you want to present at the next meeting?" So I said that I would. And as I was giving my presentation, or just as I was getting started, a gentleman walks through the door, and everyone sort of got up and said hello to him and gave him greetings and whatnot. And it happened to be Jim Swan, who mentioned that it was his first chapter meeting in some very long number of years. I think he said 10 or 15 years, if I'm not mistaken. But he came, and one of the reasons he was coming was that he had this idea that maybe the Nara chapter might be interested in hosting the next international conference for JALT, and doing it in Nara. So he had this vision for how that
Wow.
could happen, although he hadn't really talked with anyone yet. And I was eager to get involved and to meet people. And so at that meeting, I said, well, what would it take? What do I need to do? And so, he mentioned that it would be good to first get some exposure to the whole organization, and some of the folks who keep JALT running at both the chapter, the SIG, and the national level. And so I attended the next EBM, and basically from that point forward, we decided that Nara would host the national conference. So I was the site chair for the 2004 conference. We came within a hair's breadth, I think, of breaking the record for attendance. We were right up there, close to I think 2,000 participants, something like that. Um,
Wow, that's
and it was
interesting,
a
because
wonderful experience.
the numbers have
Okay.
dropped. So that was more than 10 years ago, isn't it? That's the
Yeah.
gives you an indication. I think last conference we were around about just over 1,000.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably more like, between 1,000, 1,500
Hmm.
would be a typical attendance these days. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and so just made lots of friends, and just I was hooked. And by the time that conference rolled around, I was totally bought in and wanted as much as I could get of the experience. And so I, along with some of my colleagues that were eventually on the JALT national board, Steve Brown was on that board. I think Alan McKinsey, some other folks that Mary Christensen and Hugh Nickel and a whole bunch of other folks that were taking over from a board that had really helped to set JALT back on track. After a few years of uncertainty, as I understand it, I was just coming in, so I had only sort of heard of what had transpired prior to that. But what I heard consistently was that Jim Swan and the board that took over during that time really helped to stabilize things and to move forward in a positive direction. And one of the things that they did that I have a great deal of respect for and has really informed the way that I work with leaders now in the work that I do is that there was this sort of check your ego at the door policy, right? It's sort of this isn't about any one of us, right? If it's going to be about that, then we're doing the wrong thing and we're in the wrong place, because this needs to be about the opportunities that we can all share with one another. And so it's not about any particular person's ego or their territory, so to speak. And so a big part of the ethos was contribute, learn everything you need to know to make a mark and to help the organization, find other volunteers, get them up to speed, and then move laterally out of the way, still stay involved, don't burn out and take your bat home, which happens a lot in volunteer organizations. And so that model is one that we really, I think, got going. And so we got some good volunteers and a nice pipeline of leaders in the organization. And it allowed me to really explore with this. After being on the board, I stayed on, did some international affairs committee work for most of the time that I was still in Japan. And then I was also simultaneously working back at the Nara JALT chapter level, organizing events in Kansai. And in particular, doing our best. I think you'll recall, Lee, because you got involved around that time. So this would be sort of like 2006 to 2012-ish, that we were really active in partnering with other organizations, not just neighboring JALT chapters, but also other organizations in the area. Some of the other organizations with a higher concentration of Japanese teachers of English. And so just really networking and making the most of our resources by sort of finding synergies.
Very interesting. It's interesting to hear you talk about that ethos of checking your ego at the door. I think that's probably still prevalent in JALT because it's, as you say, it's a volunteer organization. It's not like, a corporation with a CEO that can point, this direction, off we all go, follow me. It's not like that. It really is a very democratic organization at its roots. Yeah. And, being volunteers, that means that people are committed in a typically different way than what they would be with employment, for example. And so running, EBMs, the executive board meeting, the executive board is the collection of group leaders. So JALT has, the various groups, basically special interest groups and chapters, about 30 of each spread out throughout Japan, and they come together and form an executive board at the national level. And so you were actually the vice president at that level, am I right?
Yes, 2004 to 2006, I believe.
And at the same time, you were the president of the Nara chapter?
No, I think I handed that off during those years, and the move that I made when I decided that I was going to move out of the way and make some space for other folks on the board, on the national board, was I'll go back and be president of Nara JALT if one of our Nara JALT officers puts their name in the hat for a national office. And so that was Ann Maeda,
I see.
who then was elected to the board as the program manager,
I see.
or director of program.
And you've mentioned Jim Swan,
Mm.
who was the president of JALT at the national level in that era, and we are very fortunate to have Jim with us today. So I'm going to bring in Jim now into the conversation. Jim, are you out there? So we're fortunate to have with us Jim Swan, who's been a very active member of Nara JALT for a long time, going back into the past, and former president of JALT at the national level. Jim, welcome. Hello.
Hi, glad to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you with us. I want to ask you about your time in JALT, and if we can sort of look back through the decades of Nara JALT, and if you could give us an idea of what it was like when you were very active with JALT.
All right. I go back pretty far to the days when JALT was CULT.
Cult.
Kanto Association of Language Teachers and the Kansai Association of Language Teachers. And there was also a group in Nagoya. And I was living in Tokyo at the time. I came as a student and stayed on for a few years after that and got married. And my wife and I decided that doing conversational school part-time work was not going to be a viable future, so we decided to go for advanced training. And we applied at several different universities in the States, and we were accepted at several, and we just chose the University of Hawaii. And part of our application process, we thought we should have some kind of, qualifications that show that we're interested, so we joined Kanto Association of Language Teachers and put that down in our application form. So we went for 2 years to the University of Hawaii and came back, and we ended up in Kansai instead of Kanto. And I think at that time, the two had merged and had become Japan Association of Language Teachers. So during the time we were gone, it changed from CULT to JALT. And so that's when the organization started to really take off. So that would be 1981, about the autumn of 1981, when we came back. And I was pretty active in the Osaka chapter. I don't think I had any officer position, but I attended meetings. And eventually Osaka got big enough to break off. There was Osaka chapter, Kyoto chapter, but there were enough people coming in from Kobe and coming in from Nara that the chapter was big enough, and they decided to see if we could make 3 viable chapters. So Kobe people didn't have to travel so far, and Nara people didn't have to.
What year would you place that?
That would probably be around 83 or 84. I can't exactly remember.
Right. And all right, so let's now look at what kind of opportunities, especially in terms of professional development, that JALT can offer. For example, a younger, early career teacher coming in or thinking about coming to Japan, or perhaps already here working in Japan. What, based on your experiences, what do you think JALT can offer younger folks? Steve, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I guess, when someone used to come up with a great idea for something that JALT should do, I remember quite clearly Jim's response would always be, "Spoken like a true volunteer," which is, don't come in with a lot of ideas that you want other people to carry out for you. But
I'll write that down.
Really take the organization for what it is, and that is a community of good people that actually has some solid resources, right, at its disposal. So, you know, apart from the funding that's available to put on events and to come together and bring people together, there's also the access to venues, there's access to speakers and to subject matter experts in particular areas. And so, you know, I remember when people would ask me questions like, is a JALT membership worth the cost of the annual membership? And I would say, well, that depends on how eager you are to actually make the most of it, because there's certainly the opportunity to do that for anyone. And so I think that it's not the only network of teachers, language teachers in Japan, but it's quite a robust one with solid resources and people who are genuinely there and accessible and open to sharing with others, and to helping to bring people together around you know, common interests. So it's fantastic in that regard.
Yeah, you raised some good points. JALT does have considerable resources that can be very advantageous for people getting started in their careers. As you say, access to speakers, there are grants, you know, venues and whatnot. Jim, would you like to add anything to that for younger folks that are, you know, thinking of getting involved with JALT, or, you know, for example, thinking of coming to Japan for teaching?
Well, I just remember my own days. I finished my master's degree in language teaching, and came back and I got a job, walked right in, and it just wasn't prepared for it at all. I mean, it was just so different from anything that I'd studied, you know. And all I could think of was, man, I need help from somebody who's had some experience here, and I was the only guy on the whole faculty, you know. And so I ran down to the Osaka JALT chapter and got started, and that's it. The camaraderie and the experience with the other people who've been here before, and they know what Japanese students have problems with, and can help you get their legs, you know. So I would just say that just being in contact with other people is a great start.
Yeah.
So people coming over from a study program, and you study in a vacuum in a sense, you know. There at Hawaii, there were practicum courses. You're supposed to learn how to do some teaching, but the students are a completely different beast than the students here in Japan. If you ended up at a really high-level school, that's one thing you can adapt to yourself because the students are flexible. But if you're at a low-level school like I was, it's just like, what am I gotten myself into? That's where the camaraderie really goes on.
Yeah, that resonates with me and my experience too. When I was actually in language schools, teaching in language schools for 5 years in Japan, and then I made the shift to a high school, to working full time in a senior high school, and I found myself in a whole new world. And I looked around, and all my network that I had with these language schools had sort of evaporated. You know, the people had gone back home, and I was in a completely different situation. And I looked around and I thought, wow, I got to do something about this. And I was fortunate actually to bump into yourself, Jim, and you mentioned to me you should look up JALT, and I did. And yeah, it was that network, that already formed network that you can walk into, and you can meet people. And obviously there are events. I suppose what we do at Nara JALT, events, face-to-face, in-person events are our bread and butter. And you can learn a lot that way. And then there's the special interest groups as well, which extend those professional development opportunities, you know, to online and, for example, publications. But really, I think getting involved, actually volunteering and first of all, being an officer with Nara JALT exposed me to more responsibility and another set of people, and then volunteering also at the national level. I learned so much, and continue to learn so much. And I think, being in Japan, and being non-Japanese, I have to make this point, you're going to be limited in terms of, if you speak the language fluently, then you'll do very well. But if you're not fluent in the language, your professional development opportunities are going to be somewhat limited. If you're a teacher in a school, for example, that's the reality of the situation. And JALT, I think, just broadens your opportunities, and you can get involved at local level or national level and learn so much. And I think that's really important for people, for being an expat outside your country here in Japan. Even if you're Japanese, I think there's still a lot to gain from being part of the network, being active, being part of JALT.
I think you and Steve both are perfect examples of you get out of it what you put into it, and the more you put into it yourself,
exactly right,
you get out of it. And both of you have just taken that philosophy to as far as it can be taken, I think. So.
Yeah, I agree 100%. When you become a member of JALT, you get these publications sent to you. You get discount at conferences, and of course, all chapter events are free across the country. And that's one thing, but actually, more importantly, is the opportunity to get involved, to push yourself, to develop your skill set, to meet new people, and that's really I think the meat in the sandwich for professional development in JALT. I think, Steve, you'd probably agree.
Yeah, for sure. And both of you touched on something that it's easy to forget about once you are beyond that point yourself, in your sort of journey or your career development in Japan, which is that early on things are quite unstable, right? The way that contracts are written up for language school teachers or for adjunct teachers, even at the university level, are that you don't have a lot of stability, you don't have a lot of guarantee in terms of your employment, and just leave aside any compensation considerations, but just to be able to know that you're going to have a place in a certain environment for a number of years. Even at the university level, it's quite difficult, and you have this sort of rotating one-year contract, extendable up to 5 years, right, kind of thing. And I think that when I've talked with folks who are earlier on in their experience in Japan, and they've asked, what's the best way to find something? It sounds like these tenured position or tenured track positions tend to be these sort of unicorns, very difficult to find out there in the wild. I said, well, if I were in your position, I would be thinking about demonstrating your energy, your expertise, your creativity, your ability to work with people, all the things that make you someone who would be a fantastic person to work with and a big contributor at any organization, any institution, and do it as publicly as possible. And maybe not only in JALT, but JALT is one of the best places that I can imagine doing it. Certainly worked out well for us. And so don't come in expecting someone to give you a job, but use it as an opportunity to show people what you can do. And quite often, those same people, or some of those people, are going to be people who get wind of an opportunity before others might. And so, I was introduced to so many fantastic opportunities through people that I knew through JALT that knew that I was serious about doing good work and would not make them look bad, essentially.
Yeah. But that's a great point. Bears repeating, I think, Steve. Exposure, being part of the JALT network, people will see what you can do. and that's, you know, that can really help you further your career in many ways. Okay, well, I think we can wrap this up. We've covered some really interesting ground here with sort of tracing back the history of Nara JALT through the decades, and your own experiences and what you've taken from your time in JALT and from your time in Japan. And I would like to thank you both for your time today, for giving us your perspective and your time and being part of this conversation. Thank you very much, Jim Swan. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and it's been a great pleasure talking to both of you again. It's been a long time for both of us. So.
Thank you, sir. And Stephen Nishida, thank you.
Yeah, likewise. I've really enjoyed it. I could do this for hours.
Fantastic. Well, we hope to see you both back at Nara JALT, the next event, or sometime in the future.
We had plans to be there now, but unfortunately, we are stranded and disallowed from entering for now. But we'll be there as soon as we can.
We don't know when the next event will be, or, you know, when we can get back to you know, traveling internationally, but I hope to see you both sometime in the near future. Thank you again.
Very good.
Okay, so that wraps up another video from Nara JALT, looking at the ways JALT can provide professional development opportunities, and I wonder what opportunities await yourself. You can keep this conversation alive by leaving a comment down in the comments section. We'd love to hear from you, and we look forward to seeing you at future Nara JALT events when we eventually can get back to live in-person events, hopefully sometime in the near future. See you then.